Very, very pleased indeed to welcome our guest this evening, Professor Richard Dyer, someone who I'm sure is very, very well known to everyone here, at very least through his enormous body of work, body of writing on film studies. Someone who is, I would say, entering a new phase in what's a very distinguished career. He's just fresh from having finished all of your final teaching duties, I understand. Which is not to say by any means that Richard is stepping out of academia, far from it. And the work that we're seeing tonight is from a BFI Classics that Richard just completed on the film La Dolce Vita. Slightly reminds me of Tony Benn, when he said that he was stepping down as an MP to spend more time in politics.
Exactly.
Withdraw from university to spend more time in academia. So, as I say, very distinguished career throughout film studies that you'll all be aware of, probably from just about the only scholar who might appear in almost every single one of your courses. Richard's written on topics from Sound of Music to Shaft, from American film noir to British heritage cinema, sword and sandal films, written on topics as diverse as music, as the history of lighting, of film magazines, which I think all speaks to the way that Richard's work has an uncanny ability to be at the same time both pioneering, so setting out a whole new area of study for film, and also definitive. He put together a groundbreaking edition, a collection of works by different scholars on gaze and film in the 1970s, wrote about entertainment and utopia, wrote the book Stars, he's written the book White, written on popular European cinema, each of which seem to open up in tiny fields for film study, at the same time as seeming to have a certain obviousness to the area, but of course that's what it is that we should be studying. Why haven't we thought about turning our attention there before? I think within this eclectic nature in Richard's work is something that perhaps we could say is running throughout it, the idea of pleasure, or at least of the experience that cinema can offer its spectators. Having said that, his most recent book is on serial killers in European cinema, so the ways in which that's pleasure, perhaps not quite as straightforward as The Sound of Music or Shaft. Which I think makes the topic of tonight's talk, the coming of La Dolce Vita, in a way both a return to those earlier ideas of pleasure that were there right from the beginning of Richard's investigations into film, as well as incorporating some of the different directions that he's gone in along the way. I first met Richard because of his research into Italian cinema, for example, and he also wrote a monograph on Nino Rota, who's the composer of La Dolce Vita, called Nino Rota. It's a nice, succinct title, which people might want to bear in mind when engaging in academic writing, the importance of a succinct and direct title. But without any further ado, I should welcome Richard. Thank you very much. I look forward.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming, and also thank you for inviting me. It's Southampton. I've been lots of times to Southampton, and I never recognise it. I think I must always go to a different part every time. It's a very strange experience, but it's always great to be here, and especially it's a wonderful department, and it's lovely to see Louis, of course, I've known for a long time now, and a great admirer of, as well as a friend. This is a talk about La Dolce Vita, and I think I might just turn the lights down. Which I think one might fairly say is one of the most famous films ever made. And one index of that is the familiarity of the title. And just to give you some examples of the way that, and the title originates pretty much with the film itself. Here are just a number of different examples from all over the place. The black and white photo is a nightclub in Birmingham called La Dolce Vita, which isn't there anymore, alas. And I don't know, do any of you actually know this restaurant, which apparently is in Southampton? No one's been to La Dolce Vita? Anyway, apparently it's there. So a huge range of kinds of things. So it's a film that's very famous, and you don't need to have seen it to know about it. It's got that sort of quality. I suppose Gone with the Wind might be another example. These films that acquire a status really almost losing their moorings in the actual film itself. But it's also been a very important film it's had a big influence on film itself. Just to take a wide variety of examples, there's many more in the monograph on La Dolce Vita that I just completed, which will be published by the British Film Institute, if you want to know more. For instance, a burlesque starring two of the most famous of comic stars of Italy, which was made actually more or less, it was made before La Dolce Vita itself had been released and was shot on the sets of La Dolce Vita. So that's that one. Darling, to represent films that are frequently compared to La Dolce Vita. Much of the coverage of Darling, which came out in 1965, I think, talked about it being a British answer to a British version of La Dolce Vita. There are people talk about references in particular films. For instance, this mock-up which I found online is the bottom, which is the opening shots from La Dolce Vita, or this one at the top there, of the statue of Christ being flown to the Vatican. But many people say that the sequence in Goodbye Lenin, in which the statue of Lenin is flown across in a helicopter, is a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to La Dolce Vita. Similarly, La Grande Bellezza, everyone called that the new La Dolce Vita. It was so widely and possibly slightly misseen as that. It may have been slightly misleading to see it as that, but clearly there are many similarities. And there are also a lot of porn films called La Dolce Vita. And this one actually, although it's a gay film, is actually very close in terms of its narrative structure and so on to the original Dolce Vita, obviously with one or two gender alterations. So, it's a very famous film, it's a very famous reference point in life in general, in cinema in particular. However, I want to kind of go back to the film itself, and I've got two sort of thoughts really here. One is simply to put it into context, to put it back into what it came out of, hence the coming of La Dolce Vita, the things that led up to La Dolce Vita. And here am I very much thinking of I think to me a basic principle of doing contextual work, and that is that you start from the film and you get the film to prompt you where to go. What does the film suggest you should look for in the context? Rather than sort of thinking, what was the economic situation of Italy in 1959 when the film was made? How can we see it in the film? That kind of model often seems to me to be very problematic in terms of the relationship between a text and its context. So this contextualization, the work starts from the film and kind of starts to work outward. But the second thing I want to emphasize is an idea of mediation. What I mean by that is the way that everything in this film is, as it were, aware of the fact of media construction. And it's aware of it in several different ways. First of all, almost everything in the film is in fact based upon a previous media story. So almost every event in the film is actually based upon something that really happened and was taken up in the media. That's either an event that became a news story of some kind, or else it is celebrities and personalities who become well known in various circles, sometimes quite restricted circles, sometimes very broad public circles, but they were kind of well-known people. So either through referencing particular stories in the media or through referencing people who were becoming kind of media people themselves, the film is rooted in the media in that sense. But there's a second sense in which mediation is important for the film, and that is that the film is constantly showing us the process of mediation. It actually shows us people taking photographs. The film is about a journalist who is covering the sort of society scene in Rome in 1959, 1960. So the very central character is himself someone who is mediating this life of the rich and famous in Rome. He is mediating it through his writing, and he is generally held himself to be based upon one of the first people who was a celebrity journalist in Rome at the time. But there's even a third sense in which mediation is going on. And that is, of course, the film itself, the film La Dolce Vita, is reworking these elements. So it isn't just taking them and reflecting them, it's actually reworking them into something else, something that is itself a kind of, I'm not quite sure what word to use, but a kind of engagement with the very fact of mediation. So the film is itself based in the media, it takes everything from the media in some sense. It shows the process of making things into media events, but it itself is a film. It itself is using those elements to transform them into a kind of meditation on, engagement with, but also getting off on, to some extent, the pleasure in and the terror of that whole process of mediation. So I'll say some more about those things as we go through. But let me just start with an extract. And this is actually the very opening of the film.
Let me just check
Yeah.
the sounds over here.
Should be.
Yeah, that's good.
It's very quiet at the beginning, I'm afraid. So this is the very opening of the film after the credits. Okay, let's go back now to the PowerPoint. Okay, now one thing I just want to just to sort of draw your attention to, and then I'll come back to it right at the end. I still find this incredibly thrilling, the moment that the shadow of the helicopter and Christ figure sort of fly up the side of this apartment building that's in construction. And if you think about the logistics of doing that in the period, the amount of rehearsals it surely must have taken, there's nothing in the literature on it talks about this. It's kind of an incredibly exhilarating, and actually the whole the pace of the editing, the pace of the camera movement in relation to the movement of the mainly boys who are running after the helicopter on the ground, all of that is just consummate and just exhilarating, I think. And that sort of tonal quality of the film is a very important thing to remember. And I'm not going to be talking much about that now because I want to focus on this issue of mediation. But it's important to remember that all of this mediation is in the context of a film with extraordinary exuberance, extraordinary skill. And so I just wanted that to be in your mind, and I will touch on that right at the very end. Well, this event is in fact based upon a real event. A statue of Christ was flown by helicopter to St. Peter's in Rome. It was a gift, in fact, from the people of Milan. I mean, how much the people of Milan actually made that decision, but it was called a gift from the people of Milan, and it was taken to and it was actually happened on the 1st of May 1956, and then that was, of course, itself filmed and became one of the elements in the newsreels that were shown every week in cinemas across Italy. So the date of the Cinegiornale, the newsreel, is slightly later than 1st of May necessarily, but the event was the 1st of May, and it was the 1st of May because it was a statue representing Christ the worker, so it had a kind of Christian socialist meaning at the time. So even this opening event in the film, the very opening shots of the film, are based upon a prior event that was actually filmed and was shown and was already, as it were, available in the media, just as everything was available in the media that then goes into the whole of La Dolce Vita. But also it's important to note that the second helicopter, and we learn this very soon after the opening shots, the second helicopter contains a photojournalist and a journalist. So they are covering the story. And actually the fact that they are the only people covering it in the film rather suggests it's what we might now call a photo opportunity. In other words, it's not just a real thing happening which the press go along and film. It's a real thing happening in order for it to be filmed and turned into a media event. So it's not just an event mediated, it is already what we might now call reality TV. It's a reality that's been constructed entirely for the purposes of being on television, or in this case being on film. So, but then La Dolce Vita itself is showing us that process of sort of double mediation, if you like. But thirdly, of course, the film itself, as I've said, so the film's based on a media event. The film shows us mediation, the process of turning things into media. But thirdly, it is itself a remediation. For instance, if you compare the image of the newsreel with the image of from La Dolce Vita, of course it's in various ways changed. So whereas here it's strapped to the side of the helicopter, here it's hanging from, it's also exaggerated with this like it's blessing Rome in that sort of gesture. So there's a way in which all these cases, the film constantly refers back to events, but always in ways that shifts them in various ways. Like nobody ever quite plays themselves, even though, as I will be telling you in a little while, almost everybody, a lot of the people in the film are, the aristocrats are aristocrats, the intellectuals are intellectuals, but they're still not quite playing themselves. Everything is slightly already being changed and transformed. And so similarly with this story, there are all sorts of subtle changes, but in the context of people having available to them the original. So the whole process by which La Dolce Vita is mediating the events is also available to be noticed. But there's yet another kind of mediation going on, and that is in relation to the history of representations of Rome, particularly in the post-war era. That La Dolce Vita is itself reworking a perception of Rome that developed through the period. And one way to illustrate that in relation to this opening sequence is to compare it. This is the last shot of Rome Open City, which of course is one of the most famous Italian films made and often seems a turning point in the history of the cinema. Well, that is the shot of these boys walking very dejectedly, having just seen the heroic figure of the resistance priest shot. They are walking back, and in the distance you see St. Peter's Basilica, so in other words, the centre of the Catholic faith. So although it's in some ways a dejected image, it's slow, they're defeated, there is perhaps some sense of hope, of redemption, because in the background you have got the centre of the Catholic faith, and certainly this film is a Catholic film in some sense. Well, this is almost like the opposite of La Dolce Vita, where you have it coming, where it seems to me it is the same thing, it's boys walking into the screen, as it were, but from a different direction. Here they're shouting and there's movement and so on. And most fascinatingly, they're walking towards this. Now that is in fact not St. Peter's Basilica. It's actually called San Giovanni Bosco. It's on the outskirts of Rome. It was in fact a new church at the time that La Dolce Vita was made. So there's a way in which, but it clearly is clearly in many ways modelled on the church of Catholicism, which is St. Peter's in Rome. So it's like the film is almost recognizing this kind of way in which the culture is copying other elements of the culture. And it's alluding to a kind of moment of hope, a moment of great significance in the history of Italy, post-war Italy, but alluding to it and twisting it, and not perhaps undermining it, but calling it into question, calling it into kind of sort of problematizing it, as it were. And that's what I mean, and it gets sense, again, the film is in this kind of complex relationship to cinematic representations of Rome. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of the kind of what I'm trying to talk about here. These different, putting it into context and thinking of it in terms of these different senses of mediation. Just as a reminder, or even if you haven't seen the film, a brief introduction to the film. This is a film based around the character of Marcello, who is a journalist, and who is covering sort of nightlife and events, not major political events, but sort of showbiz events and so on in Rome in the period. He covers, amongst other things, he goes to nightclubs and so on, but he covers, amongst other things, the arrival of the American actress Sylvia to Rome. That's perhaps the most famous sequence in the film, a long sequence. He covers a miracle, a case where two children said they had seen the Virgin Mary, and this becomes a kind of media circus. Everybody crowds around these children, hoping they'll see the Virgin Mary again. He covers an intellectual soiree at the house of a friend of his called Steiner. He goes to an old-fashioned nightclub with his father, where he meets an old flame of his. Marcello meets an old flame of his own, not the father. And he goes to a party in an aristocrat's castle at a place called Bassano di Sutri, these are all real places. And he also, the last party he covers, he goes to, is a party at a place called Fregene, which is out on the coast outside Rome. And this party is full of sort of people on the edges of showbiz and the film world. And by this point, from having been someone covering the world of spectacle and showbiz and celebrity and so on, Marcello is now actually a publicist. So he's in the business of promoting those celebrities in that world rather than merely covering it from outside. So it's just a series of those sequences. There are some personal story elements in it too, which I'll leave aside for the purposes of this talk. But that's the basic kind of structure, and I want to just refer you to that. And what I want to do now is to go through the film in chronological order and just point out the ways in which it is based upon but mediating things that are real. But first of all, this comes up, I can't remember if it's the beginning or the end of the film. It says, people, facts and places in this film are fantasies of the authors. Any apparent reference to reality is purely accidental. Never has that been more untrue than in this film. It's a complete lie. Of course, Fellini was famous for saying, "I'm a liar," which of course is one of these Zeno's paradoxes. If he says he's a liar, then when he's saying that, is he lying? And if he's lying when he says it, it means he's not a liar. I won't try and go any further. So anyway, that is not true. I've already mentioned the way in which this sequence at the beginning is based upon a real event. At the first nightclub that he goes to, there's a character called Pierino, played by someone called Joe Staiano, who is almost like a native informant who sort of gives him information. And he recurs at various points throughout the film, explaining what's going on, knowing what's going on, and so on. Now, he's a very interesting figure, Pierino, Joe Staiano, because Joseph, and here he is in a later scene on the Via Veneto. He was what you might call a professional homosexual. He became a kind of scandalous figure because he was very sort of outrageous and out and about on the Roman scene, and sort of got taken up as this celebrity. But as I say, he was famous for being homosexual. That's what he was famous for. And he appeared in various guises. For instance, he judged a Mr. Muscle contest. He danced in a fountain, and of course one of the most famous scenes in La Dolce Vita is of the actress Sylvia dancing being in a fountain. And just before the film La Dolce Vita appeared, his memoir called Roma Capovolta appeared, which was this scandalous account of his kind of queer life, which was, of course, immediately denounced and immediately, of course, sold very well as a consequence. So he was actually a kind of well-known figure and an interesting figure in the history of homosexuality in a way, because that's what he was famous for being. He was famous for being homosexual. In one of the first scenes on Via Veneto, well, even before that, we have this character, you can just see him in the background, who's called Paparazzo. And I'm sure you all know, but the term paparazzi, which everyone uses now in relation to kind of photojournalists especially, who kind of swarm round celebrities and so on, everyone says the paparazzi. The word, in fact, comes from La Dolce Vita. The name of the character, Paparazzo, was invented for the film and has now become used to mean any photojournalist of this kind. And these were a kind of new breed at the time, one of the most famous being Tazio Securelli, and he was one of the many photojournalists that Fellini consulted at the time for images and for assistance and so on. Now, what was significant about these photojournalists wasn't just that they were, they were taking photos of celebrities and were part of the emergence, in a way, of celebrity as a notion in this period, but also they were using new kinds of lightweight cameras, which meant they could get in very close, and then they would use flashes. So they get in close and take a flash. But that was actually very invasive. So although it enabled them, and in the past, a lot of this kind of snooping journalism, as it was called, was often taken from behind bushes or with zoom lenses and sort of thing. But this kind of going up close both got the close-up image, but at the same time was invasive and often really annoyed the celebrities. And one of the most famous cases was of King Farouk, who was a kind of playboy prince living in Rome at the time, in exile, who was out and about with showgirls and so on. And he was a real target. And you can see this is one of... And these images themselves became the favoured images. In other words, images that weren't just of King Farouk or whoever at a nightclub, or in this case on the Via Veneto, but also resisting it, also annoyed about it, also responding to it. So as it were, the paparazzi themselves were part of the story. Even when they're not seen, they are part of the story. And that I think is referenced actually in the very first nightclub scene in La Dolce Vita. But we get a lot of references throughout the film, and we get sequences in which we actually see the paparazzi. This is a scene from towards the end of the film, towards the end of the sequence dealing with Sylvia, the actress, and they come back from a night out, Marcello and Sylvia, and they're immediately surrounded by these pestering paparazzi, which leads to a kind of fight with the paparazzi, particularly with Sylvia's husband starts to fight them. Well, those shots of people fighting, scuffling with the paparazzi, they were news stories themselves. So not in the sense it's wheels within wheels, that this shot, this overall shot, is making reference, it is showing us the process of mediation. But what it's also showing us is the way in which the process of mediation itself became the news story. And I just wanted to put in one or two examples of these sort of paparazzi news stories. And this one actually featuring Anita Ekberg, who is the actress there. And it's just to sort of give you an example of the way in which this was a very common trope of photojournalism, to show the photojournalists being attacked as part of the story. And that then becomes part of the complex play on mediation in La Dolce Vita. The film is actually not much, but it's always talked about being set in Via Veneto, which was a trendy, fashionable, smart street in Rome at the time. This is the Via Veneto, a postcard from the period. This is in the studio, because in the end, though they did begin to shoot on location, in the end they ended up actually shooting it, recreating it in the studio. And Fellini was interviewed afterwards and said that now whenever he went to Via Veneto he couldn't stand it because it didn't look real. So there's a way in which that's another sort of further play upon the play with mediation. In relation to the miracle, this is based upon an event in 1958, so 1 year before La Dolce Vita started shooting, in which apparently the Madonna appeared to two children and cured an encephalitic child at a tiny little place called Latteria di Marata Alta near Terni, about 100 kilometers from Rome. And this became a news story, but in many ways the news story was the media circus, that all the people that descended upon this this little tiny little hamlet, the way they descended on it, and then that became the story. And one of the people that covered it most brilliantly was Tazio Securelli, and so who was is still in a way the most famous of the paparazzi. Now, there was an article at one point in which the local clergy said they didn't think there was a true miracle, that it was just a media circus. Well, that may or may not be so, but the important thing in terms of the film is indeed this recognition of this extraordinary huge numbers of people. It becomes this sort of major media event, and we see the journalists manipulating the situation, getting local people to say things, getting the relatives of the children to sort of say they've seen things, say they've heard things, and so on. They, as it were, they are themselves at one point, actually, one of them produces a script which he gives to the uncle of the children, so that the uncle will say, oh yes, this is what the children did. So there's a way in which we see those processes, and this is in a context of not being believed. However, it's worth mentioning that in some ways the question of whether or not anything happened is still left kind of ambiguous by the film in ways that relate to a whole other issue about, is there anything real in this film? Marcello goes there with his fiancée, Emma, and she absolutely wants to believe that there really has been a miracle. And then she meets someone and says, oh no, I'm sure it's not true. And then meets another woman who says, well, does it really matter if it's true? What is true is that, as it were, that Italy is full of spirits and myths and ideas. It's an ancient land, and there's a kind of presence of ancient ideas, whether or not they are in a literal sense true. And that woman was played by someone called Mariana Leibel. And Mariana Leibel was a writer and a psychoanalyst, a Jungian psychoanalyst, who was, and Fellini was very influenced by Jung's ideas. And so she is in a way articulating an idea that we don't need to necessarily think of literal truth. Things may have a psychic or spiritual truth, and that may be important to hang on to. And there are these moments in La Dolce Vita when this possibility is glimpsed, but it's so fleeting, it's almost taken away from you before you start. But it's interesting that it's there, and that in a way, in one of the most manipulative, the most mediated of all sequences in the film, you have this statement about that even here, maybe you can find something that's spiritually true. Moving on then to Sylvia, and there's lots that could be said about that, and I will come back to Sylvia. So let me just stick with the press conference. In the press conference, there's a long press conference sequence. Everybody in that press conference was a journalist of the time and is playing. They're not named, they're sort of playing themselves. They're often film critics or journalists of the time. This is just a list of some of the ones who can be seen, and I'll just show you one specific one because this is the writer John Francis Lane, who wrote for the British magazine Films and Filming. And so he's, again, just one of the people there. And he actually wrote a memoir about having been in the film. So they are, as it were, all those critics are actually critics. All those journalists are actually journalists. So it's drawing upon them, although they're not necessarily, in an explicit way, playing themselves. Similarly, at the intellectuals party, all these people here are kind of well-known people about the artistic bohemian intellectual scene in Rome at the time. So, for instance, near the beginning, he meets a woman and meets her, Anna, who was actually a woman called Anna Salvatore. And Anna Salvatore was a well-known artist of the period and slightly notorious for these sort of sapphic images that she drew. That is as near, actually, as this film gets to any recognition of lesbianism. And you'd have to know who she is to know that. But nonetheless, she was well-known. She's one of this very interesting category, I think. She was well known to people who knew who she was. She was well known in some certain kinds of restricted circles. So we might now just talk about the bubble. So the bubble of Bohemian Italy would know who she was, but she wouldn't. And there would be some presence of that in the popular press, but obviously much more limited than of, say, a movie star. Or indeed of the miracle. But nonetheless, there is a sense in which she, amongst all these other people in this sequence, are well-known people. Probably one of the most famous at the time is Leonida Repaci, who was a poet, and this is a painting of him. This is an Irish poet who actually speaks some words from The Tempest at one point, but he was with an Irish accent. That's how I suppose he's playing himself. He's never named, actually. And the one that I suppose interests me most is a woman called Iris Tree. And Iris Tree was really quite a well-known personality across the kind of cosmopolitan bohemian world, across Europe. And she was the granddaughter, I think, of Beerbohm Tree, who was one of the most famous actors in Victorian England. And she was a poet, but she was also a model, and she was a model both for Modigliani and then also later for Vanessa Bell. So she's a kind of rather interesting figure, and she appears. So but everybody in that sequence, what you could pick out, I just picked out one or two. They are all artists and intellectuals and bohemians, or bourgeois bohemians really, who are, would be relatively well known in certain circles with a certain kind of media presence. Turning to the aristocrats' party, everyone at this party is an aristocrat. Just to name one or two, I mean, I don't know who they are, but I know what they're called. And so we've got here Contessa Elisabetta Cini and Conte di Dobrezensky. Here we have Prince Vadim Bolkonsky. The prince is the man in the dinner jacket, standing looking down at this point. That's who that is. And in some ways perhaps interesting to illustrate particularly is Doris Pignatelli, who the Principessa di Monteroduni, who was quite a well-known figure in the media, even to the extent of being on the cover of Life magazine. I don't think it's a bit distorted, but it actually says the best dressed woman in Europe. So, and in fact, one of the most spectacular costumes in the film, designed by Gherardi, was designed specifically for her. So she was kind of famous as a kind of patron of haute couture, and that's what's sort of being drawn upon here, as well as all these people actually being themselves aristocrats who were part of this half publicly available world. And then finally, to take Fregene, this scene of these kind of hangers-on to the film industry, and just to take up three examples of people, everyone, again, one could say who they are, but three examples. One is Laura Betti. Now, Laura Betti went on to become actually a really very well-known actress, particularly associated with left-wing theatre and left-wing film, particularly associated with Pasolini. But even at this point, this is pre-Dolce Vita, she was already very well known as a kind of provocative, left-wing, sort of Brecht-associated singer and actress, even at the time. And in fact, she has a big row in the film with Marcello, and she accuses Marcello of selling out, whereas she, in some sense, represents kind of being true to her principles. Actually, that row is based upon a row that Laura Betti and Marcello Mastroianni actually had when they were rehearsing the film. And Fellini heard that and said, will you reproduce that for the film? It's an odd case of drawing something there was a private row which is then turned into this public event. So, but she was already a kind of a well-known figure in certain kinds of theatre-loving circles. This is this man who's there. He is Jacques Cernas, who was quite a big star of Italian cinema. He's French, but quite a big star of Italian cinema in the post-war era, particularly associated with making either the kind of sword and sandals movies. This is Helen of Troy, which is actually a Hollywood-Italian co-production, but also melodramas of one kind or another. So he was really quite a big, well-known, the good-looking young man of the period. In the film, in La Dolce Vita, he plays someone who's a has-been, someone who's desperately saying, can't you give me a job, can't you find me a part? So it was quite brave of him to play that part, because by this time Jacques Cernas was a has-been. He was no longer the handsome young man that could be in every film. He was someone already sort of aging, no longer really in a position to get those roles. So he is, in a way, although he's not named, he's playing someone very close to who he is. One more example of the character called Nadia, who is played by an actress called Nadia Gray, who was quite a well-known actor right across. She made films in Britain, she was actually Yugoslavian, she made quite a few films in Italy as well, and France, so she was really quite a well-known, a kind of starlet, I suppose, not quite a star, but not quite just someone that no one knew who they were. Well, she plays someone who has just had a divorce, and in theory the party here is a party to celebrate her divorce. And she does a striptease. which is one of the very famous sequence in the film, is the striptease done by this rather respectable actress doing a striptease. Now, it's always said that this is based upon an incident in the Rugantino nightclub in 1958, in which a young woman called Ike Nana did a striptease. Fellini always denied it. Fellini, right to the end, always denied that this sequence was based on that. But it's interesting that nonetheless, first of all, he's of course he's a liar, but also secondly that everyone else says it, and it was a very sensational event. Now, why was it sensational? Because, okay, it was a private party, someone takes their clothes off. What's so sensational about that? Well, partly, of course, believe it or not, people didn't in those days, but also it was a party full of very respectable, well-off people. And who was there? Tazio Securelli, the paparazzo, his name has already come up. And he took these photos, and then they were published in the press. But what was important was not just that they showed a naked young woman, a woman stripping and so on, but how close these respectable bourgeois men, and indeed some women, how close they are to the scene. So there was this kind of double threesome of this sense of this was almost kind of pornographic act, and yet it was right in the middle of this group of people, and right in the middle of a group of respectable, rich people. So this was almost like a kind of revelation about the kind of tackiness and tawdriness of the elite, which had not really fully come to light. It's one of many events that were coming to light at this time, but this was in this incredibly vivid visual account. So this is often seen as a really key event in the context of the Dolce Vita, whether or not it was deliberately referring to it or not. So what I've been trying to show so far is the way it draws upon and deals with and addresses and plays around with media events and media people. But of course, the other part is the reference to what came before, which I've already referenced in talking about Rome Open City in relation to the end of Rome Open City and the beginning of La Dolce Vita. But actually a really important film in this is the American film Roman Holiday, made in 1953, which was a hugely successful film and really kind of put Rome back on the map. Obviously Rome has never not been on the map. It's one of the most famous cities in the world. But there was a way in which it perhaps had become a bit tired, a bit of a kind of old Rome that, you'd go and look at the ruins. But the sense it put Rome on the map in the sense of being an exciting happening place, a now place, a place for rich and exciting people to go to. And it was hugely successful, and there are a lot of people involved in the making of it, including some of the script writers for La Dolce Vita were also involved in writing for Roman Holiday. And as you can see, it was widely, hugely successful in Italy. It wasn't just an international success, it was hugely successful in Italy. And I think it's part of a movement within films from 1945, the end of the Second World War, to 1960, the year of La Dolce Vita, a move in films about Rome, which essentially is a movement from films about Rome, which are essentially about Rome and Romans, and the ordinary Roman people who live there. And then that is gradually transformed in an uneven process to Rome becoming a spectacle for tourists, and indeed even Romans making themselves into a spectacle for tourists. So this looking back at these Rome films is itself looking back at a kind of media changes in the media representation of Rome, many of which were kind of made possible through the success of Roman Holiday. I've already touched on this change. One example, here are a couple of films. This is from a hugely successful film called Poor But Handsome, 1957. And this is from a film Via Margutta, which was a famous kind of Bohemian road it's still there, but it was always thought of where artists lived and so on in 1960. And I think what's interesting about these shots, but also if you see the whole sequence, these are both shot in Piazza Navona, of course one of the most famous tourist destinations in Rome, but they're just there, they're just ignoring them. These are films about Romans, and that, yes, they might live close to the famous monuments, but they're not interested in them, they're just there. Well, they are kind of beginning of a whole series of films, which I just put up some titles here, many of which, some of them are sort of famous films like Il Signor Max, Rome, or I Soliti Ignotti comes up later. These were famous films set in Rome. But what's interesting about how many of them either have Rome in the title or else are drawing upon famous streets or monuments in Rome, whether it's the Campo dei Fiori or Via Margutta or Piazza di Spagna, Villa Borghese, Via Veneto, etc., right down to Fontana di Trevi and Via Margutta at the bottom. So these are films that are very much really selling themselves in terms of Rome, but with a shift gradually, including some American films, being hugely successful, Three Coins of the Fountain, as well as Roman Holiday. And these are films that are kind of sold on the promise of an image of Rome. But as I said, what you get in the process is a shift away from films that are really about Romans in Rome to films about Romans being a spectacle for tourists, or at any rate for the elite, and not for the kind of common people. One example of this is clear, I think, in Poor but Handsome, which I seem to have now put at 1956. I must just check when it actually was, 56 or 57. In this film, very interestingly, at one point, this is about a group of young people who live in the centre of Rome, but nonetheless don't go to the expensive nightclubs and so on that you see in La Dolce Vita. And at one point, they, in order to impress his girlfriend, one of the characters takes his girlfriend to a nightclub called, as you can see, Antica Roma. And we've already got there, really. It almost looks like the beginning of some of the scenes in La Dolce Vita, of these nightclubs that are also somehow this kind of fake, this kind of phony old Rome sort of set up and design and so on. So they go there, so there's a sense in which they are themselves going there. And of course they meet immediately one of their friends who is working there. And the whole sequence is about them not really being able to fit in there. So there's a way in which this Rome, what's increasingly becoming their Rome, is not really for Romans, unless those Romans turn themselves into spectacle, which is, as it were, the only way for them to survive. And a lot of the later films, like 58, 59, 60, they're actually tour guides. Or if they're not true tour guides, they pretend to be tour guides in order to pick up foreign women and so on. So there's a way in which the whole shift is towards this idea of Romans becoming part of the spectacle of Romanness. And one example of this is this film, which was in Italian, co-production in Italian, called Arrivederci Roma, based of course upon a very famous hit song at the time, which was itself in a way packaging Rome. And it was then recalled Seven Hills. It was called Seven Hills of Rome in the English language distribution. And there's an extraordinary scene in this in which a little girl is singing Arrivederci Roma as if it's some kind of as if it's some kind of folk song. It was actually written that year, but it's not this being sung as, oh, this is the song that everyone sings. It's a kind of folk song of the time. And she's not doing very well, doesn't get any money, everyone ignores her, until the American singer, Mario Lanza, who was, of course, an Italian-American singer, huge star at the time, he comes along and he shows her how to sing this folk song properly and authentically so that she then gets lots of money from the tourists. So it's fascinating, almost like demonstrating in itself this process of Rome making itself into a spectacle for foreign consumption. But it wasn't only the films that were part of this cinematic Rome. Rome became, just for a moment, this fashionable place in cinematic terms, particularly because a lot of Hollywood stars went to make films in Rome, but then, of course, to do that had to come to Rome, and that meant that they were actually part of the glamour of Rome. Here we see Joan Crawford, who is signing on the Via Veneto, and here we have Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner it being snapped by a paparazzo, no doubt. And these stories were not only kind of the standard glamour of Hollywood stars in exotic locations, but also, again, led to these kind of paparazzo stories. And this actually is a shot of Ava Gardner and the wonderful Italian comedian Walter Chiari, who were having a relationship, and this is him, this is Walter Chiari attacking Tazio Secchiorelli for trying to take photos of them in an uncontrolled way. So this, again, you know, the glamour of Hollywood, and Hollywood on the Tiber, I put Hollywood sul Tevere, that's Hollywood on the Tiber, that became also part of, as it were, the cinematic Rome, and that cinematic Rome was itself mixed up in this whole sort of paparazzo business. Now, all of that comes together with extraordinary complexity that you will find I get muddled in trying to explain in the sequence dealing with Sylvia. Sylvia is the American star who comes to make a film in Rome. We never find out what the film is. Now, she is this blonde, big-busted blonde woman who is clearly based upon the whole wave of the fashion for big-busted blonde women stars in this period, of whom, of course, the absolute most famous is Marilyn Monroe, but most countries had their own sort of Monroe look-alike. This is ours, for instance, the wonderful Diana Dawes, but there are every country, and then, of course, lots of other Americans as well. So, first of all, Sylvia is a reference to that wave of a certain kind of look that was sweeping international cinema at the time. But one of the most famous of these was a woman, an American, Jane Mansfield, and Jane Mansfield was making films in Rome at the time and was indeed featured by the paparazzi. And here she is with her husband, Mickey Hargitay, who played muscle men and Tarzans. And actually, Sylvia's, the characters, now concentrate, Sylvia, the character's husband in the film, is played by Lex Barker, who used to play Tarzan in the film, but Sylvia is also referencing blonde women, one of whom famously is married to a muscle man who played Tarzan in a film. So, it's full of that, this whole sequence. So, Sylvia is a reference to a type of star. But Sylvia is also, of course, an actual star, Anita Ekberg, who was, as it were, Sweden's answer to Marilyn Monroe. So already we've got a Swedish Marilyn lookalike playing the role of an American Marilyn lookalike. Now, Anita Ekberg was actually really quite a big star, much bigger star than I realised, because she's now so famous for La Dolce Vita. Her kind of prior fame tends to be forgotten. But, this is all advertised, and this was quite a big, expensive film. It was all advertised around Anita Ekberg's appeal. And here we see her in one of these scandalous stories. It's about her and Gary Cooper, The Lost Weekend with Gary Cooper. So she was, so we've now got Anita Ekberg, who's a Swedish lookalike, but who is also Anita Ekberg. And at certain points in the film, it's very clear that she is acting a Marilyn lookalike. So, for instance, when she's asked what does she wear in bed, she says 2 drops of French perfume. Well, that's a play upon what Marilyn is supposed to have said, that she wore Chanel No. 5. And similarly, at another point, when Sylvia is running up the steps of St. Peter's in Rome, and she says, "Oh, this is really good for the figure, I must tell Marilyn." So there's a way in which there's a kind of reference to the fact that she's referencing to this character. And Anita was a well-known person. And this, of course, is the most famous, possibly the most famous shot in the whole film, of Anita Ekberg in the Fountain of Trevi, at the end of the night out with Marcello Mastroianni. Well, Anita herself, only 2 years before, had been shot at the sort of 5 o'clock in the morning in the Trevi Fountain, and that had been one of the stories in the news coverage of the time, in the kind of gossip columns of the time. Moreover, and this gets me into something I haven't really touched on at all, the filming of this sequence was itself a media event. I don't know if you can see, but it's absolutely packed. I mean, there was very widely advertised that, Anita Ekberg is going to be, and of course it was made to sound more lascivious than it was, is going to be bathing in the Fountain of Trevi. And so you can just about see, I think, at the back, that really it was hundreds of people that flocked to see this. So we've got a media story that's based upon a media story that the filming of which becomes a media story. One last complication, and then also at the end of the sequence, I've already mentioned, when Marcello and Sylvia, after the Trevi Fountain sequence, he takes her back to the hotel, and the paparazzis descend, and Sylvia's husband slaps her. I'll just show you these a couple of shots of Sylvia's husband slapping her, and then the paparazzi all gathering round to film it. This, of course, is based at one remove on an incident from Anita Ekberg's life. Anita Ekberg was married to a now rather forgotten British star called Anthony Steele. This is their wedding in Italy, very a lot of publicity, and obviously that's a set-up photo. But gradually their relationship fell apart, and they too were involved in these sequences with the paparazzi, with running after the paparazzi and attacking them and so on. So we've got, I'm not sure I can even try and go through it. We've got a Swedish actress who looks like Marilyn, playing the part of an American actress who looks like Marilyn, based upon the actual stories and the incidents in the life of the Swedish actress. I think it's even more complicated than that. We're already some way towards a sheer play of reference to mediation within the film. One last thing, just going back to the famous striptease of Arche Nana. Who should be at this Rugantino night spot but Anita Ekberg? And there she is, and it is even said that Anita Ekberg had actually encouraged Arche Nana to do this striptease, and actually Jacques Cernas, the has-been star in the Fergeni sequence, was also there. So, wheels within wheels and complications and so on. Okay, to finish then, just to say something, what I've been trying to say is put it back into context. It comes out of things, and what it comes out of is the media, which itself, it shows the process, this whole process of things becoming media events, and it also, it transforms them and plays with them and so on. Now, one of the things I was trying to think about, well, in a way, if you like, so what? And I was trying to think about this because in a way, the account I'm giving that everything in the film is always already mediated and is then transformed in a process of mediation sounds like a certain kind of postmodern account of postmodern culture. And this, of course, would be kind of early to be talking about something being postmodern. Now, let's not get into arguments about, what is postmodernity and when is it. Let's not even do that. But nonetheless, it's a very familiar kind of argument. Now, one thing to say, and I won't go into this in too much detail, but this is more a kind of general theoretical point to make about mediation. The fact that something is mediated does not mean it never existed really. So the fact, for instance, that the opening sequence shows you the mediation of this statue being flown to St. Peter's doesn't mean the statue wasn't in fact flown to St. Peter's. So some theories about mediation sort of end up with the idea there is nothing but mediation. It's a hall of mirrors, that there's never any point of the real, which I don't think is what the film is about, and it's certainly not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to trace the way in which it does that. But still, what it shows, nonetheless, is utterly caught up in this sense of mediation. And I think, in a way, you could say that the film's quality, the film's particular affective quality, is exactly a way of bringing together two different responses to the idea of media saturation and a world so full of media construction. It's between what you might call a bleak postmodernism and an exuberant postmodernism. And I think the film is an unresolved between those two affective responses. So certainly the narrative of this film is extremely bleak. And it could be that the whole sense of everything's a mediation, everything is how do you ever get back to the real, all sorts of things happen in it which are absolutely devastating and destructive and terrible, and it ends with a real sense of the main character being just sucked into this dolce vita, this world of kind of meretricious media events and celebrities and so on. So that would be a kind of bleak view of how kind of all sense of the real, all sense of understanding, all sense of politics too. I mean, it's interesting to think about this in this particular few months we've just had. That all that sense of that we built up the post-truth world. Perhaps this is a post-truth world of La Dolce Vita. I mean, that's one view, and perhaps currently one might feel that more just because of what things are like at the moment. On the other hand, the film is also such fun. It's so exuberant. I mean, the use of movement to go back to the helicopter up the side of the apartment building. I mean, the editing, the movement, the coordination of movement on screen and camera movement, the wonderful flowing music. All of that has a kind of incredible brio to it. So another view might be that this is a kind of exuberant postmodernism. And this is saying, yeah, everything really we know about is mediated, but get over it. Just get over it and get off on it. You know, just enjoy it. Just go with the flow. Just don't worry. Just take things as they are with all the energy and colour and variety and so on that postmodernism, if it is that, delivers. So what I'm trying to suggest is I don't think the film can at all be tied down to postmodernism in that way. I don't think, and it may even be kind of wrong to even use the term postmodernism, but I think it does relate to this very widespread perception of we live in a world in which we kind of live by the media, in which everything is always already mediated, and that there's almost like a hall of mirrors. You're endlessly caught up in mediation one way or another, and I think the film is exactly a bleak, an extremely exuberant, enthusiastic, joyous film about bleakness, and it's just that paradox which perhaps suggests different relationships to mediation. As I say, a mediation which is in despair that one can ever attach to anything real. And of course the fear that need for something real leads of course to a Trump, or leads to various the kind of figures that are emerging in our time, and leads of course to Islamic fundamentalism as well. So that leads to this desire for something that's real as opposed to this endless froth. But on the other hand, isn't froth fun? Why not enjoy it? Just go with it. Just get over it. And I think the film remains poised at that different way of relating to mediation in all the extraordinary range of different ways in which it's shown it. Thank you very much.
Okay, time for questions, comments, time for you to put that hand up. Do you need a glass of water?
No, I'm fine, just want to sit down.
Yeah, do you want to go for it?
Thanks for the great lecture. I really enjoyed. And my question is, as far as I know, the Federico Fellini is kind of last generation of Italian realism, or maybe someone who tries something different from the former generation.
Yes.
So, and you mentioned some mediation on your lecture. So, do you think, is there any relationship between mediation and trying to pursue some kind of his personal style of realism?
Well, I think his relationship to neorealism is very interesting, because he was never right at the centre of it, but he was writing scripts. He was in some of his early films are usually very often considered to be part of neorealism, particularly Cabiria. And Cabiria is the most obvious precedent to dolce vita in his work. And there are elements, I mean, paradoxically, there are elements in dolce vita which are truer to neorealism than many other directors who are more considered to be more truly neorealistic. So it's episodic, for instance. It is all based upon actual events. The actors in it, when they're not main characters, are more or less playing themselves. If you look at the actors in, say, Rome Open City or Bicycle Thieves or Umberto D, to take the kind of pinnacles, they are not professional actors, but nor are they playing people like themselves. I mean, the actor in Bicycle Thieves was an extremely well-placed engineer. He was not an out-of-work, unskilled labourer. So there's a way in which, in certain ways, Fellini is being truer to neorealism than many other people. I think the point is that all of that's true, but nonetheless there's always that sense of, yes, but it's a film. And that in a way, the kind of the fantasy of neorealism, and this, André Bazin touches on this, the fantasy of this is that somehow a film can be reality, but a film can never be reality. It can only be a film. And I think what you find throughout, and 8.5, I suppose, is the absolute logical conclusion of this. What you find in Fellini's work is this kind of increasing desire to recognize, yes, there's all sorts of things about neorealism that are interesting, but in the end it's a film. And it's a kind of movement towards that recognition that the only thing that La Dolce Vita can be in the end is a film. And that's, so I do think it fits into his career and its complicated relationship to neorealism, in that way.
It's Sally, just also, people who do want to make a point, think of spectacles. I left my spectacles at home, so if you do want to make a point, do stick your hand up quite high. But I saw where Sally had the...
I found your talk immensely suggestive. I'm old enough to remember some of those stars, etc. So it's really evocative for me. But what you're saying reminds me, of course, of Amarcord,
Yes.
which, of course, is making a film that is autobiographical.
Yes.
But he, instead of location shooting in Rimini, he recreates it.
Yes.
And I think, for me, that touches very much on what you're saying
Yes.
about his relationship
Yes.
to the real. That it's, for him, the creation of reality is about the creation
Yes.
of process.
Yes. I think that's right. And of course, for instance, the shooting on Via Veneto in Dolce Vita, they wanted to shoot it on location, but the police. Well, one version is there were just too many crowds and the police were annoyed. Another version is they weren't paying the police enough. But whichever it is, they ended up in the studio. And a lot of the story of La Making of La Dolce Vita is kind of giving up on a location and ending up making it in the studio. And of course, after that, it's more and more location shooting. So by the time you come to Amarcord, you're absolutely right. It's almost there's hardly any non-location shooting. And of course, Amarcord is fascinating because although it's kind of is autobiographical and isn't in a way, because I mean in all sorts of ways. I mean without going into, I think it's I think what interests me about it so much is that it's such a lovely film. Amarcord is such a delightful film, and it seems like this rather nice film of memories of the 30s. Actually, the more you look at it, the more complicated it is, with all that complexity of, well, who is remembering and what do we remember, which always ends up in that same position of, in the end, it's not memories, it's a film. So that's where it ends up. But I think you're right, it's a really important film to bring into relation with Dolce Vita.
I just wondered, you counselled against kind of looking at the film and looking at the film as evidence of a sort of predetermined points in history or in Italian society, but if I may for a moment do that, of course there is the fact that in 1960 this was new, and this was a different kind of society.
Yes.
It's Italy in full flush of the economic miracle, and something which the neorealists, which the left more generally, were quite angry about, the way in which Italians, as might have been put by its critics, that Italians were turning their interests away from their kind of real conditions and just interested in celebrity and Americanization and so on. And so I just wondered, again, one of those ambivalences maybe, or ambiguities which is there, is in the way in which something which is ultra modern and very, very new is being captured by Fellini, at the same time in which there's a sense that it's always been this way. What is the Vatican but spectacle? What is the Colosseum? Well, actually, it's a large place for people to go and see shows. So I just wondered about that.
Well, I think there's lots of things there, because I thought you were going somewhere else, which is, I think, ultimately, you would trace all this back to the shifts in society, shifts in the economy, and what the economy made possible. But I'd want to go through the whole development of the film industry and the celebrity industry, and et cetera, to get to that, rather than just starting from that. But I think that thing about the ancient is absolutely fascinating. Maybe I haven't really thought it through. I mean, perhaps just two things. Just another thing I thought you had. So I kept thinking, I know what he's going to say, and then you didn't say it, which is great. The left, of course, this film was a problem for the left when it came out, because they had come to disapprove of Fellini already, and they thought he was too sentimental and too drawn to kind of spectacle and all the rest of it. So they may well have not wanted to like the film. On the other hand, the Catholics really hated it. So they felt they had to defend it, but it's always a bit slightly lukewarm, their defence, I think. But I think, going back to the ancient, I mean, it's just rather... One of the reviews was by Alberto Moravia, and he said, this is the Satyricon for our time. And of course, 10 years later or less, Fellini makes a version of Satyricon. And I think there is a way in which you could interpret this as just saying, Rome has always been like this. Rome has always, in exactly the ways you're referring to. So, I don't know what the answer... So maybe it is, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. That it really is. There's nothing new about it. I think what some of the things that are new about it in the period are the internationalism of it. Of course, again, Rome was always international, but it was kind of, it came, I suppose what it is, it came out of a period of not being. It's this kind of sudden moment of international cosmopolitan fame, which had really kind of a bit been off not just because of fascism, even before fascism, even in the 19th century, even with the Risorgimento, it's sort of it wasn't off the radar exactly, but it wasn't quite. And then there's suddenly this moment of that, and also because of the paparazzi, which I don't know about, but I mean, my sense is that although the technology wasn't uniquely Italian, that particular mode of salacious photojournalism in close-ups and flashes and so on was very Italian at the time. So I suppose, yes, you could say it's variation on a theme I suppose the reason I'm sort of making a mess of the answer is that I'm sort of trying to avoid Rome, the eternal city, which of course is such a thing that's said about Rome. And in a way, I think one of the things that's striking about the film is how much the eternal city is glimpsed. That although it's true that there's always been spectacle, it's somehow either, it's in the opening shot, that isn't actually an ancient Roman aqueduct, but it just swishes past it and goes off to the modern city. So there's a way in which the things that are thought of as the eternal qualities, and the church, of course, too, are kind of sidelined in favour of this, or else, in the case of, for instance, one of the big nightclubs was shot in the Caracalla baths. So, but it's almost like the baths are turned into something which no longer means the eternal city. So I think, but I need to think more about it. I think there is some complicated relationship to that idea. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, for a talk with so many sort of wonderful observations about the film, it seemed a bit disrespectful to ask about something you haven't talked about. Right. But for a talk about mediation, something that was clearly deliberately avoided, I'm presuming, was the mediation of the film on its release.
Right,
and
yes.
I just wondered whether you had any thoughts or comments to say about that.
Well, there's a lot in the book about that. Partly about it being a media story even before it was released. So it wasn't just the shooting of the Trevi Fountain sequence. Even before it was shooting, even the question of who was going to produce it was a media story. So it was right from the beginning, and that's of course rather fascinating as part of how the implication was that this world of Via Veneto and Rome celebrity was, as it were, was something that should be made into a film, and therefore who was going to make this film? Well, the big Oscar-winning director was going to make it. So there's all of that. And then it becomes a story afterwards, like for instance at the premiere in Milan, not in Rome, where it was fairly just applauded, but in Milan, Fellini was spat at and called the devil, I thought, or something. So there were those kinds of media stories. Then there was the whole question about, was the church going to call for it to be banned? Was Parliament going to ban it? Who was behind that? Was it this extreme right, as which some people say, organisation, name I forgot. Was it them that was trying? So there was all that controversy, and then of course it was a controversy when it was shown abroad, and both I think it won the prize at Cannes, but it was shown in various places, and it was always a controversy in that sense. So yes, it was a media story for a long time, and then of course in a way it becomes forever a media story. I mean, the number of times that Trevi Fountain sequence appears in advertisements, in jokes, in clips, in YouTube. I mean, it's just everywhere. So there's a way in which it gets taken up in what would be a classic argument about postmodernism, entirely deracinated, entirely without really meaning anything except being this famous image. So yes, it does. So it goes through various stages.
Any thoughts?
This is quite a similar question to the previous one, sorry. I've looked at La Dolce Vita a couple of times and I never realised the extent of the mediation process that happens. I knew like a couple of things.
Yeah.
Was this process sort of written about at the time? Was it something that the audience would have been aware of? Or, like, does that even matter?
Well, I think those are both good questions. I furthermore have to say that probably the Italian audience could be, to varying degrees, aware. So, and certainly, for instance, during the making of it, the office, the main office of where they were making the film was, all the walls were lined with pages from sort of gossip magazines and so on. And, you know, and so yes, in one sense, they were available to be known about. But probably it wasn't that much. Most of it wasn't that much known outside Italy. And then even things like the miracle, whether people really associate necessarily with that miracle as opposed to, you know, the recurrent kinds of Lourdes and places like that, which of course are very familiar reference points to Catholics. So I think that it would be very variable how much people knew. So does it matter? Well, certainly when I first saw the film, I didn't know, I knew nothing of it, and I still thought it was wonderful. So in one sense, it certainly doesn't, you don't need to know it to enjoy it in some level. And since the film shows you the process of mediation, it's almost like it's telling you about it. It's just that you then discover just how much it's doing. I suppose, so then the question, well, I suppose what I thought, when I started to discover all this, I was astounded really to discover. It reminded me when I was a student and we studied Voltaire's Candide. And I always remember the lecturers, I had a wonderful lecturer who said that everything in Candide, I don't know how many of you have ever read Candide, but it's one of the most famous French novels ever written. Everything in that actually happened. It's always thought of as this picaresque novel, and it's all made up. It's not, it's all based on. So I thought, gosh, this is so extraordinary to do this. And I suppose what it, so I think, so I don't think it matters in the sense you can still enjoy the film. On the other hand, I think it does actually give a fuller sense of kind of what the film is doing. So it's almost, I could almost say that's why one studies. It's, when one gets a fuller sense of what the film is doing, which then I think enables one to have I hope a more, because I'm now about to imply that I've done something good, but a more precise engagement with this kind of troubling quality of this awful world, which is such fun. I mean, when I saw the film, I don't think I even realised it was a critical of this time. I just wanted to get on the next plane to Rome. I couldn't possibly afford it to at the time. I just wanted to go to Rome. I just wanted to be there. So I think, so obviously it's very, very ambivalent. And I think part of its ambivalence is in its engagement with this complex modern, particularly, I mean, again, modern phenomenon. The world never exists unmediated. Language mediates the world. So everything is mediation in one sense. Mediation is something that really exists. But it's kind of ratcheted up in the case. So it's kind of, and by seeing that, I hope it means you get a fuller sense of it, the engagement with that complexity of the relationship between mediation and the world.
Thank you.
I do just wonder as well if in that kind of double response to it, on the one hand, isn't it all terrible, but also isn't it all wonderful?
Yes.
I want to be there. If a slight kind of moralism might enter into that, the part of the pleasure itself
Yes.
is both seeing all these people living an impossible lifestyle, but also then thinking, they're not really happy.
Yes, right, yes. I think that's right. Yes, I think that's right. And there is the pleasure of moralism. I mean, again, of course, how do I really remember what I felt in 1960? But I mean, I just thought, I can't wait to dance along to Jingle Bells in the last sequence. So in one sense, it was a very simple hedonistic response. Yes. I'm not even sure that they are all that miserable, actually. I think the person who's miserable is Marcello. He's the one that wants something better and is defeated. But I'm not sure that most of the other people are. Well, no, it varies. I don't think it's just that everyone is miserable in it. I think some people are actually perfectly happy. Including Pierino, interestingly, I think, is one of the ones who's actually quite happy, really. And so there's a way in which, if you think of it in terms of its central narrative and its main character, which is Marcello, and the two women he has a most developed relationship with, and his aspiration to be a writer, which is then kind of dashed, and he ends up walking away from the camera. If you think of it as that, then it is, you can indeed have the pleasure of, oh, he's miserable, and of being superior to him. But if you think of it as this fresco, people doing all sorts of things, interacting and wearing nice clothes and so on, then I'm not sure they are miserable. I think perhaps there is also there a difference.
Okay, any other thoughts? Closing comments?
Yeah,
sure.
I really don't have anything articulate to say, but I was just trying to think of all that last conversation in relation to the paparazzo himself.
Yes.
Because it's obviously we regularly note paparazzi, celebrity culture, the film,
Yes.
and the kind of, well, obviously celebrity's always been part of film, but the changing time.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, it's 1960, right? It was
Yes.
1969 with the telephoto lens of Burton and
Yes.
Taylor, and
Yes.
that's kind of
Yes.
significant change. So
Yes.
I don't really have a question, except I'm just wondering if you have further thoughts about maybe the particular role of the camera and that annoyance with the camera in terms
Yes.
of what we was just saying, and it's kind of breaking down
Yes.
that barrier of that sort of glamorous
Yes.
start of that otherworldly life, which,
Yes.
if you just said, it's still so much fun.
Yes.
It has now this darker side to it.
I mean, I think it's very interesting that obviously there's a whole thing about invasion of privacy. And I suppose a paradox is, well, who do celebrities think they are? My privacy, who are they? They don't have privacy. They've chosen not to have privacy. And a lot of the debates, more recent time around hacked off and so on, is, it doesn't really, like, I always think Hugh Grant is heroic, really, because he said, of course they're going to film me being whatever was happening with the prostitute. I felt it was a being as if I knew. But anyway, of course they will film me picking up a prostitute, and that's fine. But these other, ordinary people who haven't asked to be celebrities, that is a terrible invasion of privacy. So I think that sentiment, but of course it's a different invasion, because it's an invasion where you actually see the invader as part of the story, and the fact that it's also kind of daring of them to get in close and to risk being beaten up, and there's a whole sort of drama around that. Whereas it's much sneakier to be a long way away and use a telephoto lens and so on. But I suppose, I'm not answering very coherently. I suppose what interests me in relation to celebrity is how much, what my sense of contemporary, now celebrity, is that of course you court the paparazzi. You don't not want them to invade your privacy. You court and try to control that access to privacy, I suppose. And that's a very different dynamic from what's, because there is still here a sense in which people should be allowed their private lives, which I think is still true. But I think in relation to celebrity, it's rather different now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's fascinating how much those images of like putting their hands up,
Yes,
having
yes.
sunglasses on, are still are things that now we think of Kim Kardashian performing on purpose.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yes,
It's just quite
yes. And then, of course, there is an interesting thing about to what extent is that sense of doing, in a way, doing it on purpose. And I think it isn't really present in La Dolce Vita. There's I think, an amazing bit, which was actually improvised by Anita Ekberg herself at the end of the sequence where she's playing Silvio and they go home. Marcello takes her back to her hotel, and the husband is there, and he slaps her, and I don't know what he says to her, but he slaps her. And she says in English, but she apparently improvised this line, "Robert, you shouldn't do that, especially not in front of people." And I think it's absolutely sort of fascinating, this kind of idea. There could be a private life, in which it would be all right in some sense to do that, but it's not all right to do it in front of people. So that sort of still, yes, a different kind of dynamic of in front of peopleness. It's at a different point than later or earlier. Come to that.
yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for a
Thank
really
you.
wonderful talk.
Well,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much. I'd like to,